dry heat shimmered above the pale road in wavering lines as Samuel eased the patrol truck to a halt, the engine's hum fading into the stillness of the late morning. Ahead, lying just off the track where dust drifted lazily in the air, a lion cub lay collapsed, its small tawny body curled weakly on its side. Even from the truck, Samuel could see the uneven rise and fall of its chest, each breath coming with a faint, rasping hitch that did not belong to a healthy young lion. He stepped out slowly, boots pressing into the fine soil, the air pressing down heavy and unmoving. In the harsh light, the cub's wound was clear, a tear along its flank, edges raw and swollen, the fur around it matted with dirt and darkened with drying blood. Flies clung stubbornly to the exposed flesh, their buzzing a low, persistent sound that made the stillness of the scene feel sharper. He scanned the surrounding grass instinctively, the habit of years in the reserve guiding his eyes over every shadow. Every ripple of vegetation, searching for the shape of an adult lion. But there was no movement, no shape, no sudden flicker of gold fur in the heat-hazed distance. The cub was alone, and that, more than the wound, made Samuel's chest tighten. Lion mothers are rarely far from their young unless they are hunting or forced away. Neither option boded well for a cub in this condition. The cub's tail gave a slow, involuntary twitch before settling still again. Its paws, far too small for the harshness of the open road, looked stiff, pads caked with grit, nails barely visible under layers of dust. The smell of blood was faint but unmistakable, cutting through the dry scent of baked earth and old grass. Kneeling a few meters away, Samuel stayed still for a moment, letting his presence be known without closing the gap too quickly. A sudden movement could spark the cub's fading instincts into an attempt to flee, and in its current state, that effort would almost certainly kill it. He let his eyes adjust to the closeness, noticing the way the cub's breathing faltered every few seconds, the ribs shuddering before the next breath found its way in. There was no energy in its gaze, no flicker of recognition or fear, only the half-lidded slump of exhaustion. Around them, the savanna stretched out in every direction, a quilt of brittle grass and red earth, dotted with low thorny shrubs and far-off acacias whose shade shimmered like a mirage. The nearest cover was too far for the cub to reach. The sun bore down without mercy, drying every trace of moisture in the soil. A light wind moved through now and then, bending the grass in slow waves, carrying with it the distant calls of birds. Samuel shifted slightly to block the sun's glare from the cub's face, his shadow cutting across the hot ground. In that narrow band of shade, he could see more clearly the raw edges of the wound, not clean but torn, as if made by teeth or claws in a quick, violent motion. The injury looked recent, perhaps from a chase or a fight near a kill site, but the cause mattered less now than the effect: loss of blood, shock, and the relentless heat. The absence of the mother added a more immediate danger. Alone, a cub was vulnerable not only to starvation, but also to opportunistic predators that would not hesitate to strike. Moving slowly, Samuel unclipped the water flask from his belt, letting a drop slide off his fingers near the cub's nose. There was a faint twitch of whiskers, and the cub's small tongue darted out to taste the moisture. It was enough to show that life was still there, but the movement ended almost as soon as it began. No effort to rise followed. Samuel's mind ticked over the facts as he observed the small form before him. The wound would fester quickly in this heat if left untreated. The cub's dehydration was already advanced, and with the midday sun climbing higher, every passing minute reduced the chance of survival. Flies swirled again as he moved his arm back, their bodies catching glints of light before settling on the injury once more. He glanced along the road in both directions, the air wavering ahead so that distance became uncertain. No dust clouds marked the approach of another vehicle. No voices, no sound, but the wind and the muted drone of insects. If the mother was alive and searching, she was far beyond sight, and if she returned now, she would find her cub too weak to follow her. He knew the choice that was forming: to stay and wait, risking the cub's life with every hour, or to act now, understanding the risk of human scent and presence around a wild lion. His knees pressed into the warm ground as he leaned closer, eyes fixed on the slow, uneven rhythm of breath, noting the pauses between each rise of the ribs. The skin trembled faintly over the bones, a sign of muscles struggling under strain. A soft wheeze came from deep in the cub's throat, more air than sound, and it seemed to pull the silence tighter around them. Samuel exhaled slowly, a long, steady breath, and let his hand rest on his knee, keeping his movements measured. He could not know how long the cub had been lying here, perhaps only since early morning, or perhaps since the day before. Time in the wild could shrink or stretch in ways that left no sign for human eyes. Somewhere far off, the dry rattle of a seed pod in the breeze carried briefly, and then there was only the heat again. The thought pressed quietly at the edge of his mind. If he waited too long, the cub's strength would fade beyond recall. If he moved too soon, and the mother returned in that moment, she might take the action as a threat. The risks were balanced on a narrow edge. He shifted his position to ease the strain on his knees, and his shadow moved with him, stretching longer over the cub's body. The tiny movement in the cub's chest continued, a fragile rhythm in the vast stillness of the savannah. Samuel stayed there, watching, knowing that the next minutes would decide whether the young lion had a chance to stand again or whether the dust would claim it before the day was done. Samuel rose slowly from where he had been crouched beside the small, wounded lion cub, his knees stiff from the heat radiating up from the packed earth, and let his gaze sweep outward across the ground in widening circles, searching for anything that would explain how the animal had come to be lying alone beside the reserve road. The cub still rested in the narrow patch of shade his body had been casting, its breathing shallow and uneven, but Samuel's focus now shifted to the land itself, where the dry surface held traces of the morning's events. Faint paw prints marked the dust in a meandering line, leading toward the road from the direction of the thornbush thickets, the shallow indentations of small feet scattered between deeper, heavier marks that hinted at speed and weight. A faint drag line arced abruptly to one side, as though something had been pulled or forced to stumble, the mark broken by sharp scuffs in the dirt and a spray of loose soil. A little farther on, tufts of coarse tawny fur clung to brittle stems of grass, caught like fragments of a story left behind. Just beyond that, a deeper impression in the ground, rounded at one end, claw marks pressed into the soil at the other, suggested the place where a heavier body had landed with force. Whatever had happened had been sudden, and it had not involved the cub alone. Samuel moved with careful, deliberate steps, keeping his boots from disturbing the clearest parts of the trail, tracing the scene as though piecing together the moments that had led here. In the overlapping prints he saw the shape of larger paws, their edges crisp and unblurred by wind, the arc of the toes, and the puncture of claw tips cutting cleanly into the dry earth. These were the tracks of an adult predator in motion, a lion perhaps, but not the cub's mother, or even another member of her pride. The spacing, the angle, and the freshness all told him this had happened within hours. He rose again and turned his attention to the land beyond, scanning for the shape of an adult lioness in the grass. Lions do not leave their young exposed unless driven by necessity, and even then they return quickly, especially if a cub is hurt. The absence of her tracks alongside the cub's told a different story: separation before the incident or forced flight. Either way, it left the cub alone, and a lone cub in this condition was more than vulnerable. It was an open invitation to every predator or scavenger within scent range. Samuel's eyes moved across the expanse of grassland, the tufts swaying lightly in the faint breeze, their movement concealing anything that might be passing beneath. The air held the dry, metallic tang of blood, subtle but sharp, and he knew it would carry far enough to attract unwanted attention. Behind him came a sound so slight he might have missed it, a thin, breathless whimper, barely lifting above the insect hum. Samuel turned at once and closed the distance to the cub in a few quiet steps. It had raised its head a fraction from the ground, eyes dull and half-lidded, ears tilting weakly toward him before sinking back down. The wound along its flank still seeped in a slow, dark line, the blood tracing into the dust beneath its side. He could see the faint quiver of its shoulder muscles as the instinct to rise met the stark refusal of the body to obey. Lowering himself to one knee again, he let his hand rest in the dust near its forepaw, his posture kept low and unthreatening. "Easy now," he murmured, the words barely more than a breath, a thread of sound intended to reassure more through tone than meaning. This time the cub did not try to flinch away. It only breathed in shallow, uneven pulls, the small rib cage lifting with visible effort each time. Samuel's mind moved quickly over the facts. The presence of fresh predator tracks meant whatever had injured the cub might still be close. If it was another lion, or perhaps a leopard, or even a group of hyenas, there was a chance it could return, drawn again by the vulnerability it had already tested. If Samuel lingered here too long without taking action, he would not just be risking the cub's life. His own safety could shift with the wind and the unseen movement of grass. Yet lifting the cub now came with its own set of dangers. Without knowing where the mother was, removing her young could sever any chance of a natural reunion, and if she appeared mid-intervention, her defensive reaction could be swift and fatal. The choice was not simple, and time would not pause to give him the luxury of weighing every outcome. His eyes flicked back to the trail one last time, committing the directions and patterns to memory for possible tracking later, and then returned to the animal before him. Every detail confirmed the injury was recent. The wound's edges still glistened faintly in the glare. The sharp scent of iron was strong in the air, and the stiffness of shock was visible in the cub's posture. Those details were more than observations. They were reminders of how narrow the rescue window had become. Without treatment, the wound would become a source of infection within hours. Without water, the cub's weakness would deepen until it could no longer lift its head. Without shade, the heat alone could end it before the day turned. Overhead, the sun hung in a bleached, cloudless sky, and the light reflected hard off the road's pale dust. Samuel shifted his position slightly so that his shadow fell across the cub's face and wounded flank once more, easing the glare and slowing the drying of the exposed flesh. The silence between the calls of distant birds felt longer now, as though the land itself were holding still. That stillness was deceptive. He knew it could break in an instant if the predator responsible for this came back to finish the hunt. In the wild, moments like this were measured not in time, but in opportunity, and every choice carried its own chain of consequences. Samuel steadied his breathing, keeping his posture calm, but in his mind the stakes were sharp and clear. Without decisive action soon, this life would slip further toward the point of no return, and the brief chance to tip the balance would be lost forever. ChatGPT said, Samuel sank back down into the dust with slow, deliberate movements, the weight of the heat pressing through his clothes until his knees were settled firmly in the dry soil just within reach of the cub's fragile frame. The air between them carried the faint metallic scent of blood mixed with the warmer, earthier smell of sun-baked fur, and for a moment he simply watched the rise and fall of the young lion's chest. It was an unsteady rhythm, shallow lifts of the ribs followed by brief pauses that seemed to ask the body whether another breath was worth the effort. He kept his voice low, letting a few soft syllables drift into the still air, more tone than words, their only purpose to signal calm. The cub's eyelids stirred, parting just enough to reveal eyes dulled by exhaustion, their pale amber clouded by strain. For a heartbeat, its head lifted slightly, muscles pulling tight along the shoulders as if bracing for flight, but the effort folded almost instantly into stillness again. The will to move was still there, buried under the surface, but the strength had already thinned to the point of breaking. Samuel could see it in the looseness of the skin along the belly, in the way the paws lay at awkward angles, pads cracked and dry, and nails dulled and clotted with dust. Dehydration was already working at slow damage, and in the unbroken heat of late morning, that alone could take the cub before the wound did. He leaned forward until the warmth radiating from its body reached the back of his hand. High, but not yet the fevered burn of infection, a small but important mercy that meant there was still a narrow path to saving it. He unclipped his water flask, twisting the cap without haste, and let a thin trickle fall across his fingers before holding them just above the cub's muzzle. A single droplet caught the light before it touched the black of the nose. The whiskers twitched in response, and the tongue emerged, slow and dry, to collect the moisture. It was an act almost too small to register, but it carried weight, a sign of instinct still present, of life not yet surrendered. Samuel tried again, another drop, holding it longer this time, and was met with the faintest swallow. It wasn't enough to restore anything, but it confirmed the obvious truth. Water was as critical now as the wound itself. In this state, even a short burst of movement could collapse what was left of the cub's reserves, and collapse here, under this sun, would almost certainly mean the end. That fact hung plain in his mind. If the cub tried to run now, there would be no getting up again. His hands shifted slowly toward the torn flank, pausing before contact, his eyes tracing the edges of the injury. The tear was ragged, with fur and flesh pulled unevenly, unmistakably the work of teeth or claws. Fresh as it was, the muscle beneath still twitched faintly under the skin, not in the involuntary spasms of death, but in the raw reactions of pain. The fur around the wound was clotted and dark in patches, the drying blood pulling the hair into stiff ridges. He leaned closer, careful not to let his shadow move abruptly, and listened to the way the cub's breathing rasped against the quiet. Around them, the land gave little away. No rustle in the grass to betray the predator that had done this. No clear sign of the mother returning. Yet Samuel knew the stillness was fragile. Out here, the absence of movement did not mean the absence of danger. The same tracks he had studied moments before could belong to an animal patient enough to wait, watching from beyond sight, ready to return the moment the cub was left exposed again. He poured another droplet onto the cub's nose. Again, the tongue moved to catch it, though slower this time, and he saw the way the neck muscles trembled with the effort. Every small motion had a cost now, every swallow or turn of the head pulling from a supply already near empty. The urgency tightened in him. Minutes here mattered more than they would in any other setting. The heat was building, the sun creeping higher with no clouds to mute it, and each passing moment tilted the balance toward loss. Observation had run its course. If he stayed in this stage any longer, the narrow window for helping would shrink past usefulness. The cub's breaths came in a short, uneven series again, the faint sound of them just audible over the distant hum of insects. Samuel extended his hand, letting his fingers brush lightly over the fur just above the paw. It was the first deliberate touch, feather-light in its pressure, and for a second there was the barest twitch from the limb. No snap of teeth, no jerk away, just a subtle acknowledgement that contact had been made. That lack of resistance told him something vital. The cub's energy was not only too depleted for flight, but also its instinctive boundary against another creature's touch had thinned. It was a sign of trust by necessity rather than choice, but trust all the same, and in moments like this it could be enough to bridge the distance between life and death. Samuel let his hand rest there a second longer, gauging the response before pulling it back just slightly. The stakes stood clear in his mind with no need for embellishment. Shock and dehydration could end this life before infection even had the chance, and out here, every choice he made had to push against that outcome. Time, in the truest sense, was the most dangerous predator circling them now. ChatGPT said, Samuel adjusted his position in the dust, sliding one hand beneath the cub's narrow chest with the other ready to support its hindquarters. His movements stayed slow, the way one might move through shallow water, each second measured so as not to jolt the animal's weakened body. The cub's breath rattled faintly against his fingers, its skin twitching in small pulses where the wound had dried stiff. He had judged the moment carefully. Lifting now was the first step toward treatment and away from the growing certainty of death under the midday sun. But before his arms could take the cub's weight, the air shifted. A faint, deliberate rustle came from somewhere beyond the first line of grass. It was not the random sway of wind, but the sound of something alive pushing through. Samuel froze, his head turning just enough to follow the disturbance without loosening his hold on the cub. Through the vertical blades, the outline began to form, broad shoulders tapering to lean flanks, the pale ochre of her coat broken by shadow. The female stood perhaps 50 meters away, half concealed but unmistakable. Her body bore the marks of hunger, ribs lifting the skin into shallow ridges, hips sharp against the curve of her belly. She did not crouch to stalk, nor step forward to claim the ground between them. Instead, she held her position, eyes locked with a stillness that carried its own kind of pressure. Samuel's gaze stayed on her, reading the space between observation and action. The distance might feel wide, but with the strength lions carried in their legs, it could close in seconds if she chose. The cub stirred faintly under his hands, not in recognition but in reflex. A tiny shift of the forepaw, the head turning slightly toward the direction of the rustle. The female's eyes tracked the movement, her ears twitching once, then stilling again. The silence between them grew heavy, thick with the balance of risk and need. In his mind, the stakes sharpened. If she charged, the rescue would end before it began. If she stayed but the cub was left here, weakened as it was, even her presence would not guarantee survival. Hunger could force her to move on. Predators did not stay in one place when food and water were scarce. He lowered his voice into the space, barely more than a whisper. "It's okay, girl," though he knew the words were not for understanding but for tone. His hands shifted fractionally, testing the cub's limp weight, judging whether a careful lift could be done without triggering alarm in the female. She remained motionless but not relaxed, her head low, eyes fixed, and tail giving one slow movement from side to side. These were not signs of aggression yet, but they were not signs of ease either. The sun pressed down, heating the soil beneath him, drawing the scent of blood more sharply into the air. That scent would travel, pulling in scavengers or rival predators if time stretched too long. Samuel understood the moment could not hold forever. Still crouched, he moved the cub slightly toward his body, shielding as much of it as possible behind his frame. The female's nostrils flared, her ears angled forward again. In that fragile exchange, each kept their ground. He kneeling, she standing guard, the cub's pulse faint against his palm. He did not turn his back, but his free hand reached slowly toward the satchel slung at his side, fingers searching for the cloth he would need to wrap the wound once they moved. The female gave no sign of advancing, though her gaze never broke from them. This was the moment the decision pressed hardest. If he rose with the cub, he would reveal his intent to take it. If he hesitated, the window to save it might close under the heat and the blood loss already slowing its breath. The tension did not erupt, but it did not ease, each second stretching under the weight of risk. The cub's life hung between two still bodies in the open grass. ChatGPT said the heat was pressing down harder now, folding into the dry air in shimmering waves. Samuel's shirt clung to his back, his knees rooted in the dust as the female's gaze pinned him from the grass. He could hear the faint hum of the truck somewhere behind, a muted presence waiting for his signal. Without turning his head, he raised one hand slightly, palm back toward the distant figures, an unspoken order to hold position. Any sudden movement from them could shatter the delicate stillness holding the space between him and the lioness. The cub's body was warm, but not with health. Its heat came from the unrelenting sun and the slow fever of injury. Time here was short. The wound's scent was sharp enough to draw other predators, and the longer they remained in the open, the more the balance tipped against survival. He lowered his hand again and let his breathing find an even rhythm before he moved. The female's ribs lifted and fell in shallow waves, each rise showing the taut skin stretched thin over her frame. Her tail flicked once, the tip curling and loosening again, and Samuel read it for what it was, not aggression, not yet, but a restless measure of the moment. He eased both arms beneath the cub, one steadying the fragile head and chest, the other sliding under the hindquarters. The animal's limbs hung slack, weightless in their weakness, though a faint twitch moved through its paw as he shifted it closer to his body. His arms closed around it, not in a grasp of possession, but in the careful cradle of necessity. The female's eyes narrowed fractionally, a subtle change but enough to send a thread of caution through him. He paused, holding the cub close without rising just yet. The stillness was a negotiation. His back muscles tightened as if bracing against the possibility of sudden motion from her side, yet she stayed anchored in her patch of grass. Her head dipped fractionally, nostrils flaring, catching the cub's scent as it left the ground. The tail moved again, slower this time, a muted pulse of energy that never broke into a step forward. He shifted his weight to his heels, rising inch by inch. The cub's head lolled briefly against his forearm before settling again. Samuel kept his own gaze steady, not fixed on her eyes but on the space near her shoulder, where the intent to move would first appear. The truck remained still in the distance, its occupants reading his signal for restraint. His boots pressed softly into the dirt as he began to edge backward toward a patch of shade a few meters behind him. Every step drew the cub further from the sun's direct reach, but each also risked closing the invisible line that might break the female's patience. The shade grew nearer, a thin scatter of thorn branches casting fractured relief across the ground. The female's body did not shift forward, though the set of her ears followed him, tracking each step. He could almost feel the tension holding her in place, as though she too weighed the cost of movement. The cub's breath rattled softly, its shallow rhythm a constant reminder of the margin they were working within. Out here, survival was never certain. Even if they reached the truck, treatment would be a race against infection, dehydration, and the injuries already stealing its strength. Finally, his boots touched the first patch of shade and he crouched again, lowering the cub to rest on a folded cloth from his satchel. The moment of release was careful, his fingers lingering just long enough to steady the animal before drawing back. Only then did he allow himself to glance once more at the lioness. She had not moved, the grass still gathered around her frame, her tail's slow sway the only sign of life against the still air. The risk had held. For now, somewhere beyond, the wind stirred the taller grasses and the heat seemed to settle into a quieter weight, though the space between them remained edged with possibility. ChatGPT said the shade beneath the acacia was thin but merciful. The ground here held a cooler breath, carrying the faint scent of dry leaves. Samuel set the cub down on the folded cloth, the heat from its body bleeding into the fabric almost instantly. He unhooked his canteen, twisting the cap with deliberate care. Every movement was slow and steady, the kind that would not startle a wild thing already straining at the edges of its endurance. The lioness was still somewhere behind in the grass, her watchfulness an unseen weight pressing on the back of his neck. That distance could close without warning, so each second mattered. Infection had already begun to darken the edges of the wound. Without intervention, it would spread quickly, and the cub's small body would not withstand the fever for long. The first drops of water touched the injury, running in thin rivulets through the matted fur. The cub twitched faintly, a reflex more than a protest. Samuel tilted the canteen, letting the flow deepen, washing away dust and dried blood. He used the corner of a clean cloth to clear debris, lifting each clump of dirt with patience. His hands moved in small, precise arcs, pausing when the cub's breathing hitched. The sound was shallow and uneven, the chest rising with effort. In the shifting light, its eyelids trembled before parting slightly. The amber of its eyes was dulled and unfocused, but there was movement, an instinct searching through the haze. A faint, fractured sound came then, low in the throat, a growl, though it held no force. Samuel kept his tone even, almost a murmur. Easy now. His hands stayed where they were, one bracing the cub's shoulder, the other easing the cloth along the wound's edge. The growl faded into a faint exhale, and the cub's head dropped again, though its eyes did not fully close. Flies circled at the periphery, quick to return, but a slow sweep of his hand kept them at bay long enough to work. Beyond the tree's reach, heat shimmered over the dry plain. The truck remained at a distance, still as stone. Samuel knew they could not stay here indefinitely. The shade would shift, the lioness might advance, and the longer the cub remained on open ground, the greater the risk from other predators drawn by scent. But the wound could not be left untreated until they reached safer cover. If he missed any embedded thorn or fragment, the swelling would worsen, sealing in infection. He rinsed the cloth again, the water's trail cutting dark lines through the dust on his fingers. The cub's breathing had eased fractionally, the chest no longer heaving with quite the same desperation. One paw shifted against the fabric, the pads curling in a brief flex. Its ears twitched once toward a distant bird call, a sign of awareness returning, however faint. Samuel read these changes with the quiet calculation of someone who had seen animals stand on the edge and return, or not. The line between those two outcomes could be narrow, and they were walking it now. When he finished the cleaning, he pressed a fresh, folded strip of cloth against the wound, holding it in place with gentle pressure. The cub's eyes flickered again, this time settling on him for a moment before drifting away. It was not trust, not yet, only recognition of presence. But it was enough to steady his next move. He secured the dressing with a light wrap from his kit, knotting it just tight enough to hold without constricting the fragile frame. The lioness had not stepped closer. But the wind shifted, carrying the scent of water, blood, and dust together. Samuel capped the canteen and sat back on his heels, letting the cub rest. Its breaths were still thin, but they were steady now, threading evenly into the quiet beneath the tree. Somewhere beyond the shade, grass whispered in the breeze, bending under a sky pale with heat. ChatGPT said, the cub's breathing had settled into a fragile rhythm, each rise and fall of its chest quiet but present. Samuel stayed crouched a few paces back now, letting the shade and stillness hold. The air carried a shift, faint at first, then undeniable. Through the grass, the lioness emerged, her movement slow and deliberate. She did not charge or posture. Her head was low, shoulders rolling in measured steps, the long sweep of her tail cutting through the brittle stems. Samuel did not reach for his pack and did not speak. He only adjusted his weight so his knees stayed firm against the ground. The distance between them closed with the silence of something that belonged entirely to this place. When she stopped, her body stood in the angled light, muscles taut but not braced for attack. Her eyes moved from Samuel to the cub, lingering there. Then came the sound, low, resonant, a call that seemed to vibrate against the air. The cub's ears twitched, its head lifting in small effort. The reply was thin. A strained mule carried on shallow breath. It was not the sound of strength, but of recognition. Samuel felt the pulse of it in the stillness, an exchange older than any human presence here. She stepped forward again, closing the last gap until her nose touched the cub's flank. The contact was gentle and deliberate, her muzzle brushing over the dressing Samuel had tied. Her breath stirred the fur in slow waves, checking, confirming. She nuzzled along its neck, the cub leaning faintly into her as if memory had drawn it upright. Then, with a motion almost too subtle to read, she turned her gaze toward Samuel, not holding it long, just enough for the weight of her awareness to be felt. It was then she did something Samuel had not expected. Her foreleg shifted, her body angling so her head could press softly against the cub's side, not drawing it away, but nudging, guiding. The cub stumbled in the direction of his crouch, legs uncertain under his own weight. Samuel did not reach out at first, only held his position as the young lion steadied itself against the ground. The mother remained still, watching, her chest rising slowly, her tail flicking once at her heel. Risk still pressed in from all sides. The cub was far from recovered. Its wound, though clean, was vulnerable to tearing if strained. Predators could scent blood from a distance. The longer they stayed exposed, the more chance the quiet here could be broken. And yet the lioness did not reclaim her young. She lingered in the margin between protection and release, her stance neither defensive nor dismissive. Samuel's hand moved at last, slow and open, touching the cub's shoulder only to steady it. The animal swayed, but did not pull away. The mother's ears twitched, but she gave no warning sound and only watched. The sun was sinking lower now, its angle catching in the dust that hung faintly in the air. Grass bent under a small breeze, the sound soft against the edges of the plain. The cub's breathing, though still shallow, no longer rattled in its chest. Its head remained lifted, eyes shifting between Samuel and the space where its mother stood. The lioness, in turn, exhaled once, deep and quiet, before stepping back into the grass, her outline dissolving into the moving stems. The cub stayed where it was, the place between man and wild, unbroken yet strangely shared. By late afternoon, the shadows stretched long across the savanna, the heat beginning to loosen its grip on the land. The air felt lighter now, touched by the cooling breath of evening, but Samuel knew the risks had not passed. The cub's wound was still fresh, its movements limited, and every step carried the danger of reopening what had just begun to heal. He remained still, his presence steady and non-threatening, while the lioness lingered a short distance away, her body angled toward the horizon. The cub lay close to the earth, ribs shifting with each measured breath, its ears twitching at faint sounds carried on the wind. When it tried to rise, its legs trembled and gave way again, a quiet collapse into the soft dust. The mother waited, her gaze fixed, offering neither urgency nor impatience, just the silent expectation that the young would try again. A second attempt brought more strength. The cub pushed upward, its back legs quivering but holding. Samuel's eyes tracked every movement, ready to step forward if it faltered too hard, yet conscious of the fragile trust in the space between them. The lioness moved then, slow and deliberate, circling behind the cub so that her shoulder brushed lightly against its flank. The contact steadied it, guiding its weight forward, a wordless instruction to follow. The cub's head lowered, and it took its first tentative steps, each one pressed into the ground as though testing its own body's memory. The grass ahead was tall and thick, swaying in the late light. Shadows folded and shifted with the breeze, hiding what lay beyond. Samuel knew the cover was both shelter and risk, concealing them from prying eyes, but also from his own. Once they vanished inside, their safety would be left to the land and the instincts that had kept their kind alive for generations. He did not move to follow. His work in this moment was not to keep, but to return. The cub stumbled once more, hind legs dipping before finding balance again. The lioness paused, looking back over her shoulder toward Samuel. Her gaze held for only a heartbeat, yet it carried a weight he would not forget. Something between acknowledgement and dismissal, as though she understood his role had ended. She turned away again, leading her young toward the endless grass. The cub followed, steps uneven but persistent, small puffs of dust rising beneath each paw. The sun sank lower, its light breaking into amber and gold across their coats. The air seemed to hold them in that color, painting fur and dust alike in the glow of the closing day. Samuel stood unmoving, his hands marked with the fine grit of earth and the faint trace of blood, the scent of both caught in the dry wind. In the stillness he could hear the faint rustle as they moved deeper into the grass, their outlines fading with each step until only the tops of the stalks trembled where they passed. When they were gone from sight, the land seemed to close in behind them, as if they had never been there at all. Samuel's breath left him slowly, his eyes still fixed on the place where gold fur had met the light. The wind carried a thin hiss through the grass, the sound soft and unbroken. Somewhere beyond, the herd animals were moving, their shapes drifting at the edge of vision in the last glow of the day. The horizon held the last of the sun, and the plain settled into quiet. Pick prompt, late afternoon, African savanna. A lioness guiding her young cub with unsteady legs through tall, golden grass, their coats glowing in the warm light of the setting sun, distant acacia trees silhouetted against an amber sky, dust particles drifting in the air, soft depth of field, wildlife documentary style, highly detailed, realistic, 8K.